So, welcome everybody to Leo's Logic. This is going to be an independent esports podcast where I'll cover all relevant and important topics that exist within the spheres that I frequent. So, Paladins, there might be some League of Legends down the way. But this one, today, we're going to be discussing the whole if you can't beat him, ban him narrative that was perpetuated around the Sir James Parker suspension. I also want to dissect some of the arguments that were in favor or defense of him, as well as those seeking to lambast him, because I've heard some extremes on both sides that ignore obvious issues. So, to get into it, for those who are not a part of the PCL sphere, for those who do not know who Sir James Parker is, who is SJP? So SJP is a seasoned Paladins console competitive player, known for DPS and flex, and over the course of his career, he's accrued 2 HRX titles and was crowned the HRX MVP for November 2018. So just to break it down a little bit more, give more context, initially attempting to qualify for Valencia with Powerpuff Boys, which consisted of Satisfies, GR Crazy, Yuki, Nitro FPS. They failed to attend, and the team acquired Styles and Wonderful, name changing to Erased before being acquired by Elevate, and that would be the first roster underneath that org for console Paladins. This lineup proceeded to become January 2018 HRX champions. After that, he was absent from the Spring LAN, but SJP made another appearance at the Summer LAN where he subbed in for Tommy Jet, who could not attend, once more under the Elevate banner. But this time he was alongside Cutie Shu, Whoosh, we had Neil Bong, and Atomic Boom. They were eventually subdued in the final by the Onslaught roster that composed of Skeppy, Trenzik, Coolmat, Miracle, and Wonderful. So not a bad roster to lose to and still top 2. And then he makes his next appearance, HRX November 2018, where SJP had showed up representing Elevate yet again alongside Shu, Whoosh, GR Crazy, and Emmett Payne. Elevate managed to dispatch Vexed 3-1 in the finals, with SJP demonstrating flexibility on multiple champions. He played, I believe, Ruckus twice. He played Androxus and then Grok. So a lot of flexibility there. And at the conclusion, he was crowned the MVP of the event. Not too shabby. Most recently, SJP had been playing for Heating Up in the PCL 2019 spring phase, a team which is currently in contention for first, their overall set score being 5-1, alongside Onslaught, who is closest to rivaling them. The only difference is one game, and we'll get into that in a little bit, though. PCL 19 so far, Heating Up had lost its first set against Onslaught. It was initially, I believe, 3-1, and then Dovahkiin, the off-tank for Onslaught, had left them in order to join Heating Up, citing that it would have the best chance of going to that LAN. Now, next time they combat, it's during the week 5, I believe, and this move of Dovahkiin going over to Heating Up in the first place frees up Sir James Parker to take that DPS or flex role, where he could exert the most individual influence. And it showed, because in week 5, the arguably diminished roster of Onslaught fell down 3-0. Now, granted, the maps were a little contentious. It was like 4-2s, 4-3s, but 3-0 is a big change from losing to that same team 3-1, right? Shortly thereafter, the Week 5 set, there was a social media expose led by Geppetto, another PCL player, and it brought attention to the egregious behavior that SJP himself had participated in. But before we delve into the actions and the consequences, I want to emphasize the impact that this had, because Heating Up was contending for first. They still are. But in week 6, when they field their sub Destronite, without Sir James Parker in the lineup, because of this suspension, they lose a map to Low-Key Scheming, who is tied at the bottom of the standing. So arguably a team that's not on their radar, that they lose one map to. And one map makes a big difference, right? I mentioned before, Heating Up is above Onslaught by 1 game differential. Could have been 2. But 1 game makes the difference, because at the end of the day, that can decide who is first place. Granted, we have half a split to go. But now that we understand and we highlight the immediate ramifications, perceivably, that Heating Up has to suffer through with this suspension, let's actually get into the crime and the punishment here, so to speak. So the initial expose was revealed by another PCL player, like I mentioned, Geppetto, who by some method managed to obtain 2 pieces of quote-unquote evidence. The first one was a Twitter screenshot, where Sir James Parker supposedly tweeted the hard R out, and It's important to know the caveat here is inspect element is something you can do on your web page, and you can actually fidget with how the web page looks on your screen. And there were accusations of this thrown out. So I'm not going to outright dismiss it, but I'm going to question the validity in its completion because that tweet doesn't exist right now. And I believe unless you contact Twitter to go through the archives, you can't prove it. However, the video that existed was in fact Sir James Parker dropping the hard R and other terminology like coon towards someone while frustrated playing Overwatch. This is something that SJP himself did not dismiss or refute, although he refuted the tweet. So knowing these things, we move on to the fact that he got the suspension, which is going to last for the rest of the duration of PCL 19 spring phase at least. I don't know if there's room for more. I don't know what the appeal phase is going to be like. That's something he's in contact with them. He knows how that works. Now, people in general are understandably annoyed because the context that this happened, it looks like if you can't beat them, ban them. And we're going to get deeper into that narrative later on and why I actually resent it, by the way. This puts a significant dent in the overall landscape, SJP being suspended, right? It makes heating up just that much weaker unless they could field someone who is at least serviceable as a replacement. But it's important to know that these actions bear consequences. So once you opt to engage and participate in this competitive landscape, you represent the coordinators of that competitive landscape. So whatever terms, whatever rules they set in place, if you breach them, they get to punish you in whatever way that they deem fit. So you're saying using language that is obviously blatantly racist, whether it be in a context where you're trying to directly involve race is different, right? These are incorrigible words. And that's something that we need to bear in mind, right? So Hi-Rez or SkillShot in this instant, they orchestrate the PCL. They get to decide who stays in it, who gets punished for what, who breaches what terms. That's on them. So being punished for this obvious consequence, it was going to come forward, and it would be doubly hurtful if they were underneath the banner of an organization as well, because then that org could further impose some sort of penalty or punishment onto a player for such behavior, correct? It might seem benign to onlookers, but many of us who are gamers are familiar with how volatile, like the analogy goes, the Call of Duty lobby can be. This is nothing compared to that, correct? And as people who have grown up in the gaming environment, I'm sure we've sat in parties where people get frustrated and verbally vomit terms that they probably wouldn't say on the day-to-day basis, just so enraged that the worst possible thing comes out. So I want to put that out there because that is something that is understandable, but at the same time, the reflex, discipline comes into play there, right? You need to be able to refrain from those actions, or at least substitute them for socially acceptable ones. Because when you are a competitor and you are trying to stay in this sphere, those actions can be used against you. Like I said, restraint and discipline are the core attributes necessary for this environment. You're not only representing the coordinator of the event, the org if you're under one, but also yourself and your personal brand, right? So let's get into this if you can't beat them, ban them narrative. Honestly, I think it's beaten to death on social media for the clout that it can gain. The crux of the idea lies in deliberately reporting the negative behavior of your competition so that you remove them from the playing field, because you don't really feel like you have a serviceable chance of defeating them by normal means. I'm going to point out the obvious problem here. This is freaking wild. The position is so indefensible because if you do nothing wrong in the first place, you can't get banned. I understand it's abhorrent for someone to report another person. And I'm not saying this is Geppetto's motive, because that would imply that Big Money was in contention with heating up in the first place, which they were not, and are not currently. But it is abhorrent to remove competition just off of the basis that they are too far beyond your reach. I think that diminishes the overall playing field and hurts the spirit of competition. Now, this does not diminish personal accountability. SJP obviously is answered for the fact that he did it. He did not deny the video. He's probably had his own conversations with Hi-Rez staff, SkillShot staff, and they've established this is what the punishment is, this is the duration, whatever conversation they had is the conversation they had. But thus far, we've only had 2 splits in the PCL. So we've had Fall 2018, which is the inaugural, and then we've had PCL 19, Spring Phase, which is the current one. We're not even through this one yet, right? It's still ongoing. So over the course of this duration of time, we've seen only 3 major bans, or suspensions, depending how you want to look at it, right? So we have the instance with Swiper the One, legendary player, attended every LAN, didn't win every LAN, but attended every LAN, for bullying, ironically, SJP, who then reported him, and he was removed from Oni Channers. And debatably, Oni Channers, according to what I've heard, were doing really well against Elevate and Scrims up until Swiper the One was banned for this. Consequent TikTok video kind of cemented that ban in that situation, but we're not here to dissect Swiper's decision-making at the time. The second instance was Ballin, which was around the start of the PCL 19 qualifiers. And this was for allegations of DDoSing, where a screenshot of a joke was taken out of context. He was consequently banned almost immediately, but he's since then cleared that up behind the scenes. And now there's this instance, which is a suspension more so, where SJP used deplorable language and was therefore penalized for the duration of the remainder of this particular split, as far as I know, right? I need to just destroy the concept that this is a widespread epidemic. This is not an epidemic. It's happened 3 times, and only twice you could debate that it was in contention because Ballin wasn't even qualified yet. No one tried to ban him to eliminate him from the player pool. That was not the narrative there. That was not the reasoning. It was over the allegation of DDoSing. Totally separate issue. Even if that wasn't the case, how on earth could it be a widespread issue? If banning out the competition is the norm, why is the Flashpoint roster intact, the Cyclone roster intact, and why the hell is the Elevate roster intact? It's because you can't just ban your competition. You would have to do something cretinous to begin with, something that you could be called out upon. And none of them do that because they emphasize that restraint. They know better. And people slip all the time. And that's what's important to highlight here, right? They'll only say things like that at a minimum, maybe in the confines of their inner circle where it will never escape. And that's speculation. As far as we know, they don't engage in that behavior at all, correct? I don't know. It's outrageous to me because it feels as if everyone's just drinking, you're just drinking the punch from the juice bowl at a cultist party and everyone's just agreeing if you can't beat them, ban them. I get it. It makes for great likes on Twitter, but that's not what's happening here. Dispel that illusion. Don't be a part of it. It's honestly offensive. Everybody is capable of much more of reasoning than that. But that being said, I don't think one mistake should be a death sentence, right? I don't think it should be a permanent definition of somebody's character. This is not a slander piece on Sir James Parker. What's important to highlight here is everyone makes a mistake, right? So he made the error, he's been dished out the penalty, and now he's got to serve that time. It's the same concept of like the entire prison infrastructure. You break the law, you go in, you come out, and you're supposed to have that. The onus of rehabilitation or reform is on you. You're supposed to be granted that opportunity to demonstrate. Now, granted, we're fresher in the situation. It only happened within like the last 2 weeks. So wait until the sentence is carried out. It looks like he already acknowledges, he accepted the video. He's moving forward through the punishment process. He hasn't exacerbated the issue. He hasn't claimed innocence. Give him the opportunity to demonstrate that reform at the end of the sentence. I don't think that's too outrageous to expect. But that aside, I want to dissect some of the arguments, some of the stranger arguments that I've seen in either defense or against him, because I've seen the argument that it's just a word. Dropping the hard R is just a word. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a word, but to ignore the gravitas, the history, the context, and the level of hatred that would go into that word historically, that's a level of ignorance that you just willfully ignorant at that point. You're participating in that on purpose. And that's just kind of agitating at this point, right? It makes me a little irate. But I mean, if it's just a word, then why don't we use that argument and flip it against people who believe that that might be the case, right? Here are a few other terms you could yell at people when they aggravate you, right? Here's a few. Degenerate, deplorable, cretin, plebeian. That's just to name a few. And none of those are inherently racist or even can be misconstrued as racist in context devoid. SJP himself understood the consequence, right? So I don't understand why anyone on earth could possibly try to defend the usage of the word. If it is just a word, use any of the other 1,000 descriptors out there. This isn't complicated. But meanwhile, on the other side of the fence, you have people who are trying to say that he should just be banned indefinitely for using the word. And don't get me wrong, obviously there's a heavy weight in history on that word. That's what we just highlighted. And I'm not going to get into a whole history lesson on we know the context. Google is also a thing. If you would really need to inform yourself, by all means go for it. But I would expect common sense should be common. So let's exert some, right? So we take to the other extreme. Permanently ban him for saying the word. I don't believe in that. That's not my thing. I have a different stance. I think half of the spring phase is gone. The other half has been taken from him. That's adequate punishment for a first offense. Otherwise, what's the point? You have to give people the opportunity to reform. Otherwise, what's the point of the punishment? People on social media, celebrities in particular, you can take a tweet from 5 years back and people get upset at that. But that's 5 years ago. And this is now, sure, but you have to put the time apart from the action to see if the individual changes. That is important to the process. There is no reason that someone who is forced to answer for their behavior should not be allowed to demonstrate their firm understanding once they emerge out of the back end of the punishment. To move on to the end of this, and there's much more that I feel like I could have touched on, but I'm not going to make this any overly dramatic, theatric type of situation. With all the numerous incongruities and false narratives like this can't beat 'em, ban 'em shit, the subpar logic surrounding the drama or the event, if you want to summarize it concisely, in my mind, it's you do the crime, you do the time. That's not debatable, but you should not be permanently marred. Your record should not be permanently damaged because you made one mistake one time. Now, if he becomes a repeat offender, then this is going to be a different conversation in the future, sure. But until he is, onus falls on him to prove that reform. And onus falls on you to be accepting of the fact that people do mess up. As a competitor, you must adhere to those terms that the coordinator themselves set or risk being subjected to whatever repercussions that they might have. And this entire narrative, again, this spiel, it can rest in peace now that we're on the same page. Thank you for your time.